Chapter 25. The Blue Lantern. The inn was abuzz with activity. Everywhere the boys looked was another table packed with animated noblefolk, laughing and conversing loudly. "All right, this is where I leave you," said Roland suddenly, patting both boys on their shoulders. William spun around to look at him desperately. He felt like they were being dropped in the deep end here. When Roland saw the look on his face, he smiled reassuringly. "Don't worry, kid. You'll be all right. Ivar said he's paying for everything, so," said Roland, suddenly seeming to get an idea. He abruptly made his way over to the bar. "Gerald!" he shouted, attracting the attention of the man working behind the bar. "What can I do for you, Roland?" asked the barkeep, pouring a beer for another customer. "These two boys need a room for the night, courtesy of Sir Ivar. They'll also need a bath and a fresh change of clothes. Add it to what he owes," said Roland. William suddenly felt even more self-conscious as he looked around at the well-dressed nobles who were regarding him and Eric disdainfully. William had never even so much as dipped a toe in a hot spring. He'd certainly never had a proper bath. "Maud, room and a bath," called out the barkeep, handing a man his beer and beginning to fill another. Roland looked over his shoulder nervously. "Ivar would also like a bottle of your finest Castilian red," said Roland, clearing his throat awkwardly. The barkeep shot him a quizzical glance, but then shrugged. He handed the second man his beer before reaching under his counter and pulling out a nice-looking bottle of wine. Roland accepted it eagerly and then seemed to remember that the two boys were still watching him. He laughed nervously as he looked between the two of them. "Don't worry, he owes me," said Roland, beginning to back away towards the door. "Wait," began William before somebody whistled suddenly from behind him. When he turned around, he saw a stout, middle-aged lady with short auburn hair looking him and Eric over with her hands on her hips. "Are you boys in town for the squire exams?" asked the lady curiously. William looked to Eric and saw him nodding sheepishly. She shook her head as she assessed their dirty, torn clothes in disbelief. "What have they had the two of you doing? I swear they're expecting too much from young pages these days," she exclaimed, turning around and beckoning for the two of them to follow her. She led them around a corner and up some stairs. William was still in awe at how large this inn was. Back at home they had an inn, but it was not much more than a small cottage with 2 rooms for the occasional travelling merchants to stay in overnight. This place was enormous by contrast. Upstairs was just as fancy too, with serene artworks along the walls and nice lanterns and candles lighting the halls. "My youngest boy's a page too. Bit young for the exams still, but when he's old enough I'm hoping for him to be an owl like my oldest. Safer that way. Course his father's hoping for the lion," said the lady, rolling her eyes and shaking her head. She continued to lead them up yet another staircase before stopping at one of the rooms. She opened the door with her key and led the way in. "Here we are, boys," she said, beckoning for them to come in with her. When the two entered the room, both of their mouths opened at the spacious, beautiful, cosy abode that had been provided for them. Unlike their cots at home, the beds featured proper mattresses and even fancy linens with down pillows. "We get a lot of students here, so we've got the beds separated. If you have any more joining you, then you'll need to pay more. Don't go trying to sneak any extras in here. Trust me, I'll know," she said sternly, looking between the two boys. Both nodded obediently. William suddenly felt tears unexpectedly welling in his eyes. He wasn't sure what caused it, so quickly turned and wiped them away while the lady was walking towards the wardrobe. "Now you've only got the one chest, but the wardrobe is a nice big one," she said, approaching the wardrobe and reaching out to open it. William felt butterflies suddenly form in his stomach as soon as she opened the wardrobe doors. "No," he murmured, reaching out to stop her. Luckily, all she revealed inside was an empty wardrobe, but he had half expected to see Anne-Marie. "We have all of our gear in our cart in the stables," said Eric, not having noticed William's subdued antics. Immediately the lady held up her hand. "Don't you worry, dear. Gerald will be sending one of the boys up with it in no time. If I were you, I'd worry more about having a bath," said the lady, raising her eyebrows and looking them over. Both boys blushed in embarrassment. "Oh, worry not, my dears. I'm not one to judge. They've got you pages doing all sorts of dirty work. Now, will you be needing fresh gowns? That'll cost extra," said the lady, looking at the two of them expectantly. Eric reticently nodded his head, clearly guilty about adding even more deficit to Ivar's bond with the Blue Lantern Inn. "All right, I'll let them know downstairs. Here's your key," she said, handing Eric their room key. "There's only the one. If you lose it, it'll cost you," she said, looking at the two of them sternly. Again, the two boys nodded understandingly. "Really, you'd be surprised how often students lose their keys," she said, shaking her head. "Anyway, that's about it. For the bath, just bring your key over to the bathhouse next door and leave it with them at the desk until you're finished. If you're staying here, you're free to use their facilities as you please," said the lady, giving the boys a smile as she walked towards the door. "Any questions?" she asked. The two boys felt like they had a million questions, but none specifically came to mind at that moment, so they both just simply shook their heads. "All righty. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. If you can't find me, ask my husband Gerald behind the bar." "Well, enjoy your stay," said the lady, closing the door behind her. For a moment, William and Eric simply stared blankly at the door before they turned to each other. As soon as William made eye contact with Eric, for whatever reason, the two of them suddenly couldn't hold back laughter. William leant on Eric as the two of them laughed uncontrollably while they both succumbed to the absurdity of their situation. "Trial by combat?" wheezed William, looking at Eric in disbelief. Eric shrugged, continuing to laugh. "I don't know, Will, but it's gotten us this far at least, right?" asked Eric, shaking his head and sitting down on his bed. William sat down on his bed too, immediately being caught off guard by how deeply he sank into it. Eric's expression suddenly sobered a little. "Look, William, I don't know what's going on with those nights, but—" began Eric. William tilted his head curiously. "All of this?" said Eric, gesturing around at the nice lodgings they'd found themselves in. "They must have a reason for it. Why would they be so interested in keeping us in the city?" asked Eric, deep in thought. William raised his eyebrows at his friend. "Wow, Eric. I think I need to cherish this moment," said William, taking a deep breath while Eric looked on in confusion. "Have I actually figured something out before you?" asked William smugly. Eric raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Why? What is it?" asked Eric curiously. "It's because you know what happened in Mistfall, right?" asked William. Realization finally dawned on Eric's face. He shook his head in dismay when he realized that William had likely hit the nail on the head. "That must be what Sir Ivar was talking about when he mentioned us having an agreement," thought Eric aloud before letting out a sigh. He paid me a lot. Our agreement was that I wouldn't tell anybody about what happened there with Father Marcus dying and all," said Eric guiltily, averting his eyes. William felt a chill run down his spine as his mind once more travelled to that harrowing night in Mistfall and the events of Lacdorian. "I thought he were just talking about, me pa and that. 'Fraid of rumours among the common folk. I suppose he must have really been scared of word getting out here in the city," thought Eric aloud. There was a long pause before William broke the silence. "Eric, I know what happened in Mistfall," said William. Immediately, Eric's eyes shot up to stare back at William in surprise. "You do?" asked Eric, a guilty expression suddenly appearing on his face. "Aye," confirmed William solemnly, his mind wandering back to his final conversations with Anne-Marie. "William, I was so in over my head, began Eric. William held up his hand. "Do you really think I'd blame you, Eric?" asked William earnestly. Eric stared back at him, with guilty tears beginning to well in his eyes. "It were those knights who were supposed to protect her. Not you," said William, shaking his head disdainfully. "That's not true, Will. I should have been there for her. When she needed me the most, I wasn't. I knew that she were alone with Marcus. I knew that she didn't want to be. But I still didn't do anything. The knights told me to leave them be, and I obeyed them," admitted Eric, finally breaking down as his guilt began to overwhelm him. "Eric, they're knights." "Of course you obeyed them," exclaimed William. "Do you really think that helps me sleep at night?" asked Eric, staring back at William expectantly. "The fact of the matter is, I could have helped her, but I didn't. When she needed me the most, I wasn't there for her." "What kind of person does that make me, William?" asked Eric, staring back at his friend with tears streaming down his face. William's expression darkened too. He shook his head. "At least ye weren't her neighbour, Eric. At least you didn't sit in your room for months, listening to her screams, hearing her pain, knowing how desperately she needed you and ignoring it, all because you were scared, all because you weren't man enough to just walk in there and be by her side," said William, tears beginning to form in his eyes too. The two boys sat in a sad silence as they collectively pondered their guilt and anguish. Neither of them had a word of comfort for the other, as they were both feeling the same pain. "Those knights have forgotten she even existed. The only thing they care about is covering their asses about that cursed cleric," said William scathingly. Suddenly there was a knock at their door. The boys hurriedly wiped the tears from their eyes as William made his way over and opened the door up to reveal the inn lady standing there with 2 college gowns in her hands. "I wasn't sure if this one was large enough, but after your bath, try it on and let me know if you need a larger one, sweetheart," said the lady, barging into their room and hanging the 2 gowns from the handles of the wardrobe. The 2 boys nodded their heads thankfully as the lady wandered back out of the room. There was an awkward silence after she'd left as they gathered themselves. "Come on, William, let's finally get a good night of sleep," said Eric, standing from his bed and investigating the gowns. "Aye," agreed William. With that, the 2 boys prepared themselves for their first night in the city. They waited until late at night, when there were less people at the bathhouse, before enjoying their first ever warm bath. As they babbled excitedly over how much hard work it must take to keep the waters clean and warm, they finally felt that foreign feeling of calmness wash over them. As he poured the ewers of warm water over himself, William had to keep his wound dry, but still managed to scrub every other inch of himself clean. Once back in their cozy room, the 2 boys tried on their fancy new college gowns before carefully hanging them up again, crawling into their comfortable beds and drifting off into a deep, well-earned slumber. As William opened his eyes, it was as though time was standing still in his same old Lacdorian bedroom. That familiar, dull, grey light from the overcast sky outside was peering through his window. It felt like it had been there forever. His curtains blew in the breeze, sending dust particles swirling drearily around his room. He let out a sigh. How long had he been lying here? How long had she been gone? How long had she not? "I'm right here," said Anne-Marie, pulling him from his thoughts. William sat up in his bed and rubbed his eyes sleepily. She was standing in the opposite corner of the room with her back to him. She was wearing her beautiful white solstice dress, which always made William's heart flutter. She turned around to face him, revealing that she was holding a bouquet of tansies. "I thought you were locked away," said William, looking at his locked wardrobe. Anne-Marie slowly walked towards him and put a hand on his cheek, staring down into his eyes. "I am," she said softly, taking his hand and placing the bouquet of tansies into it. William looked down and inspected the flowers curiously. There was something hidden in its centre. Anne-Marie sat down on his bed and reached into the bouquet, removing a single black rose which had been buried beneath the tansies. She closed her eyes and lifted the rose to her face, inhaling deeply. "I miss you so much," said William, watching her gracefully smell the flower as the wind from the open window gently blew against her long golden locks. She slowly lowered the rose and turned to face him. "We can be together again," she said softly, sidling slightly closer to him on the bed and taking his hand in hers. "How?" asked William, lost in her eyes. "I can't let you out," he said, feeling for his key which was still in his right pocket. "You don't have to let me out. All you have to do is let me in," said Anne-Marie. William slowly shook his head. "It don't feel right. I can't unlock that door," said William, looking at his wardrobe, sure in his heart that he shouldn't unlock it, but unsure of why. "Forget about that." "Look," said Anne-Marie, grabbing him by the chin and turning his head back to face her. "I'm already here." "All you have to do is let me in," said Anne-Marie, staring deeply into his eyes. He swallowed nervously. All he wanted to do was to let her in, but every instinct he had was telling him that something was wrong. Suddenly William heard a loud knocking sound erupting from nowhere in particular. Anne-Marie looked around, her face adorning an expression of deep annoyance. "What's that?" began William, looking around for the source of the sound. The world was starting to fade away into pale white around him. "Hey," said Anne-Marie, again turning his head back to face her. "Just remember, if you let me in, we can be together," her voice echoed as she faded away with the world around him. Eric sleepily walked his way over to the door of their room as the banging continued. The second that he unlocked the door, Ivar immediately burst in, looking around their room searchingly. "Castilian wine?" he exclaimed, looking at Eric in disbelief. "What?" asked Eric groggily as he tried to wake up fully enough to process Ivar's wrath. Ivar turned to look at William, who was only just stirring from his slumber. "Where is it?" asked Ivar, squatting down and looking under their beds. "Are you talking about the wine that Sir Roland ordered?" asked Eric, still confused. Ivar snapped his neck around and looked over at Eric. He got up to his feet and dusted off his robes, gathering himself. "Roland, you say," murmured Ivar, deep in thought. "How'd you sleep, boys?" asked Azalea warmly as she entered the room past Eric, who was still standing by the door. Before either of them could respond, August barged his way forward. "Great news!" he exclaimed. "We've spoken with the Chancellor, and guess what? The Duke himself is personally going to see to it that your request is honoured. You'll get your fight," finished August enthusiastically. William and Eric both stood in a stunned silence as his words settled on them. Azalea drooped her shoulders and huffed in frustration at August's lack of tact. "What?" asked William flatly, looking to Eric, who seemed as shocked and confused as he was. "The trial by combat?" asked Eric, an expression of dread suddenly adorning his face. "Yes," confirmed August. Again, the room was plunged into an awkward silence as the weight of the situation settled on the boys. "Sorry, just to clarify, I am going to actually be put into a trial by combat?" asked William, still not quite coming to grips with the situation. "Yes," confirmed August again. "With a monster," clarified William. "Yes," confirmed August once again, a beaming, excited smile on his face. He looked around searchingly at everybody else. "Why are you not cheering?" he asked in confusion. "No, wait, hold on just a minute. We agreed that it was impossible for that to happen. Since the gateway is closed, there's nothing for him to fight," reasoned Eric, walking over to William's side and looking over at the knights in confusion. Ivar let out a sigh. "The circumstances have changed. It is in the college's best interests to see that the trial by combat does happen, so they'll be bringing in one of the monsters from the desert for you to fight," explained Ivar flatly, his expression quite telling as to his awareness of how unideal this situation likely was for the boys. Again, there was a moment of awkward silence as William and Eric stared speechlessly at one another. "At least your challenge was heard, though, right? Isn't this what you wanted?" asked Azalea brightly, trying to lift their spirits a little. "I don't know how to fight," cried William as panic began to settle in. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He sat down on his bed and grabbed handfuls of his hair as he felt himself beginning to hyperventilate. "No!" exclaimed Eric, shaking his head. "This doesn't make any sense. Why would the college go to all that trouble? Why would the Duke care about—" began Eric, before his eyes began to wander as his brain whirred into action. Suddenly his gaze rose up to meet Ivar's, who gulped in anticipation, averting his eyes awkwardly. "This is about taxes, isn't it?" asked Eric, looking between the three knights searchingly. August and Azalea exchanged a surprised glance at Eric's deductive reasoning. Eric shook his head in disdain. "Taxes?" asked William, looking up at Eric and tilting his head. "It's all people have been talking about lately. You hear it all the time, right? People complaining about the taxes that go to the college?" asked Eric, turning to William. The last that William had heard about taxes was back in Lacdorian, when Mortician Cotswold had told him that he was unsatisfied with the amount of tax that was paid to the Knights' College. "They want this to be a spectacle, don't they?" asked Eric with a sigh, sitting down on his bed. Azalea stammered for a tactful response before simply nodding her head. "Why do you boys look so glum?" asked August, raising an eyebrow in confusion. "I'd have killed for a chance to battle one of those things when I was your age," he exclaimed, a fire lit behind his eyes. "I've never even touched a sword in my life," said William, shaking his head and rubbing his face in despair. "So what?" asked August, still confused. William looked up at him incredulously. "Those things really aren't that bad, you know. Naught mightier than a wild dog. Half the time you approach one, it gets all scared and tries to bury itself in the sand. Really, they're nothing to be afraid of," he said assuredly. William and Eric exchanged an unsure glance with one another. William remembered what the gypsies had told him about the monsters in the desert being dangerous enough that they were still unable to return home. He'd never imagined that they were talking about actual gateway monsters. "Listen, boys, we have a plan. Those things might look scary, but they're sheepish creatures. They'll only fight if cornered, and even then, they're far more inclined to run away than to engage," explained Azalea, squatting down and putting a reassuring hand on William's shoulder. "We won't let anything happen to you. If it seems like the monster is getting the upper hand, August here will come into the arena and finish it off," explained Azalea, again looking between the two boys as she tried to reassure them both. William and Eric remained quiet as they processed her words. "I don't know the first thing about fighting," admitted William shamefully. August let out a pained sigh, looking at the other two knights deep in thought for a moment. "I can teach you the basics," he said with an assured nod. Ivar immediately kicked him in the shin and shook his head desperately. "Come on, it's just the basics," exclaimed August. Eric watched the two of them intently before realization suddenly appeared on his face. "Okay, we accept," he shouted suddenly, hopping up from the bed and clapping his hands together, much to the chagrin of Ivar, who let out a frustrated sigh. "William will fight in the trial by combat, guided by the training of Sir August," declared Eric enthusiastically. William stared blankly at Eric. He clearly knew something that William didn't. Whatever it was seemed to have given him an incredible boost of confidence. Even though William still didn't feel any confidence in himself, he was smart enough to know that going along with Eric's plans usually ended far better for him than trusting his own instincts. He stood up and faked an enthusiastic smile for the knights too. "I'd be honored to be your student," announced William, holding his fake smile as he tried to hide his fear. "Great. Well, come and meet me in the fields near the library in an hour. I'll be there training some of Azalea's eldest squires, so you're either there or you miss out," said August, looking down at William seriously. William gulped and nodded his head understandingly. August patted him roughly on the shoulder and then turned away to follow Ivar, who had already begun leaving. Azalea nodded to the two boys before following after her compatriots. As she was leaving, she looked over her shoulder at the boys one last time. William noticed a look of concern come across her face momentarily before she disappeared. Once they'd left, he turned to Eric uneasily. "Eric, I sure hope you've got a plan, 'cause I've got to be honest with you. I'm kind of soiling my pants over here," admitted William, panic coursing through his body. The idea of being locked in a cage with a gateway monster filled him with nothing but horror. "So you didn't notice it after all," replied Eric cryptically, grinning and beginning to make his bed. "Notice what?" asked William, his interest piqued. Eric raised a mischievous eyebrow as he fluffed his pillows. "When Sir August said he'd train you, did you see how worried the other two knights were?" asked Eric. William thought back to that moment. He remembered that Ivar had kicked August in the shin. "It was a bit strange," said William, scratching his chin as he thought back to it. Eric nodded his head. "And what about all that taxation business? How would having you compete in a trial by combat help them with that?" asked Eric, tucking in his blanket. This time William was completely stumped. He felt shame rise in his chest once more, that he was again showing how intellectually out of his depth he was. "I don't know, Eric. I'm a moron, in case you hadn't noticed," exclaimed William, sitting back down on his bed in a huff. "Hey, no, William, you're not a moron," said Eric, turning around and staring down at William seriously. "This is exactly my point. There ain't no reason that having you complete the combat trial would help them. Not unless you were to fail and need a big tough knight to save you," explained Eric, punching William lightly on the shoulder. William raised his eyebrow curiously. "You mean like to prove how strong they are?" asked William. "Aye, now you're getting it," replied Eric with a cheeky grin, turning away and starting to don his new college robes. William thought back to what Azalea had said again. "She said that the monster was going to be real weak, right?" asked William. Eric nodded his head. Suddenly William's expression darkened. "That means they think I'm going to be a pushover, don't it?" asked William. Eric stammered for a moment, turning to William and looking over him with concern. "William, it don't matter what any of these nobles think of us. Do you see how they've been treating me just because of my name? I'm no different than you. I'm just a farm boy too," said Eric earnestly. William shook his head, his mind a million miles away. If they had any idea of what he'd been through, they'd never underestimate him. He didn't care if they were knights. If they'd come face to face with Anne-Marie that night, they'd have pissed themselves and ran in the opposite direction. A feeling of conviction suddenly washed over him. They may think that he's a weakling, but they had no idea how hard he'd fought for his life. They had no idea what he'd endured. He was going to show them that commoners aren't pushovers whose lives can just be thrown aside for political gains. He was going to show them all what commoners were really capable of. Chapter 26. Proving Grounds. "Hey, just wait a minute, William," implored Eric, grabbing at William's shoulder to get him to stop. William pulled his shoulder away and let out a groan of annoyance as he turned back to face his friend. "Look, just take a deep breath before we get over there, okay?" implored Eric, looking over William's shoulder at the group of squires who were sparring together. William rolled his eyes and began to turn back around. "William, come on. You need to do this the right way. This is training with a real knight. Look at this as the opportunity of a lifetime," reasoned Eric. William suddenly stopped in his tracks and turned back to face him. "The opportunity of a lifetime? After all that I've been through, now I'm being forced to try to learn how to fight because I'll be locked in a cage, fighting to the death with a monster. Am I really supposed to be thankful for this? It's all well and good for you to say that with your noble heritage, Eric, but things aren't so easy for me, are they? Said William angrily, turning back away. Eric let out a sigh and continued walking after William silently. As the two boys continued towards the small group training in the field, Eric looked at his friend with concern. He hoped that William would be receptive to Sir August's training, but right now he seemed far too emotional to be a good student. As William approached Sir August, he looked around at the people who were gathered with him. There were 3 other people, all of whom looked a little older than Will, and seemed to know their way around a sword. August was locked in combat with one, explaining sword techniques as he fought, while the remaining 2 watched. Sir August parried his opponent's attack, then suddenly stepped forward and cut down into their shoulder with his wooden training sword, ending the fight. "So, do you see how I stood with my right foot forward for that cut?" asked August, taking a step back from his sparring partner. "Yes, but it made no sense. With your right foot forward, you shouldn't have broken line to the right. For a right shoulder from the roof like that, you should have been standing with your left foot forward," replied the defeated squire, catching her breath. "Aha, but why? Why should I not have had my right foot forward?" asked Sir August, assuming the right foot forward position once more. The defeated squire raised an eyebrow and looked to her compatriots for solidarity. "Well, of course it's fundamentally incorrect," she replied assuredly. "And why is that?" asked Sir August, raising an eyebrow. "Because of the distance of the footwork, of course. We're to be knights soon, Sir August. Surely you're not underestimating us just because you landed that blow? I got confused because you were using the wrong footwork is all," she defended incredulously. "And now we've arrived at my point. You're reading my cuts based on my stance. If we behave exactly by the book, then we can also be read like one. It's important to master the fundamentals, of course, but you can't expect your enemies to always fight so mechanically. Maybe they're amateurs, maybe they're not. Either way, you need to be able to adapt. You've only sparred against other squires from the college who've had the exact same exams as you. It's important to remember that you won't be squires for much longer. You're going to start facing opponents who don't fight exactly like you do. Moving into your knighthood is going to require you using your head more when you're in combat," explained Sir August. The squire let out a defeated sigh and nodded appreciatively. "Now, why don't the 3 of you keep practicing what we've covered? I've got a new student to attend to," said Sir August, resting his sword over his shoulder and smiling brightly at William and Eric. "You made it!" exclaimed August merrily. William nervously cast his gaze towards the squires who were beginning to spar with one another. "Oh, don't mind them. They're here to learn, just like you," said August, nodding hello to Eric, who waved back politely. "So, tell me, what experience have you with combat?" asked August, raising an eyebrow and looking over the 2 boys curiously. As soon as William thought about the question, suddenly he saw the image of his father's cracked skull in his mind. He tried shaking his head to dispel the image, but felt himself starting to become short of breath as his muscles began tensing up in panic. "Let me in." "I can make it stop," whispered Anne-Marie's voice in William's ear suddenly. Although startled, he somehow managed to subdue his instinct to shout. Surely he'd imagined it. Surely it was just part of his childish antics. He shook his head again, trying to dispel his panic attack. "Ah!" August's expression sobered when he saw William's reaction to his question about combat experience. "I know that look. You've got a warrior's heart, boy. Don't feel ashamed of it. There's naught a knight worth his salt who doesn't suffer the same. How about you then, Rothmane? Any experience in combat?" asked August, shifting his gaze to Eric, who was immediately caught off guard by the question. He stammered for a moment before clearing his throat to answer. "No, sir," replied Eric earnestly. "What about the moor crawlers?" asked William, still trying to steady his nerves. August raised an eyebrow curiously. "That don't count," replied Eric assuredly. "I'll be the judge of that," said August. "Well, sometimes the moor crawlers come after the pigs on my farm. I set traps for them, but I have to use my pig hammer to finish them off," replied Eric reluctantly. August tilted his head in confusion. "Moor crawlers?" he asked, looking between the two boys searchingly. Eric nodded affirmatively. "Do you mean wolves? Foxes?" asked August, still confused. Eric and William exchanged an unsure look before shaking their heads. August looked between the two boys searchingly once more before shrugging. "Well, it sounds like both of you have come face to face with death anyway. That's important. That's the part that we can't teach you. That's the part most of the squires in this place graduate without ever having experienced. Regardless of how mighty you are with a sword, it's what's in your head and your heart that really counts. In your combat trial, that's what is going to matter the most," replied August, turning away and picking up a wooden training sword from the ground. "Trust me, whatever hardships you boys think you've faced out in your farms pales in comparison to how it feels to be locked in combat," said August nonchalantly. "He has no idea what you've been through. How dare he?" whispered Anne-Marie's voice in William's ear. Sir August turned back and tossed the training sword to William, who was too preoccupied to catch it. The sword toppled to the ground at his feet. William shook his head again, realizing that perhaps he wasn't just imagining the voice after all. He slowly squatted down and picked up the sword as he began to feel a deep anger swirling in his chest. He took a deep breath and stood back up to face August. Whether he was imagining the voice or not, it was right. It didn't matter how friendly and wise August was pretending to be. He was one of the knights responsible for all of this, and he was still standing there smugly, having no idea what he'd put them through. It was his fault that Father Marcus had been brought into his life. It was his fault that Anne-Marie had suffered how she did. It was his fault that William's family were dead. It was his fault that William had that horrific brand on his back, and it was his fault that William was having to fight this monster at all. Even after all of this, he had the gall to act like what they'd faced was trivial. As William stared back at Sir August with hatred suddenly swirling in his gut, he saw Sir August's expression change. Now, boy, that's no way to approach combat. You need to empty your bowl before we start," said August, raising his training sword in one hand and pointing it at William. "What's that supposed to mean?" asked William spitefully, holding his sword out in front of him. "When you've seen as much battle as I have, you begin to be able to feel what your opponent is feeling. What I feel from you is that your mind is full of chaos right now. You need to relax and empty that bowl of emotion you have going on there," said August seriously. William's fury was only ignited further by his words. How dare he tell him not to feel angry after all that he'd been through, after all that he had put him through? "Let's just get on with it," said William, taking a step forward. August looked like he was about to say something, but caught himself. "Fine then. It looks as though you'll need to learn this lesson the hard way. Show me what you've got. Try to land a hit on me," said August, letting out a disappointed sigh and readying himself. William felt rage flowing through his entire body. August had just given him permission to attack him. He wasn't going to pass up on the opportunity. He ran towards August with his sword above his head, swinging down at him with all his might. August took a springing step backwards and swiped his own longsword to the left, easily parrying William's bold attack and sending him toppling forward and down onto his knees as his overly aggressive strike carried him off-centre. He fell onto the ground, collapsing roughly into the grass. "When your opponent comes at you strong and hard, you must become soft and light in response," said August, gently lowering his sword. William felt his anger amplifying in his chest again. He reached out and grabbed the grip of his sword once more. "I sense that you're not done yet." "Again," said August, raising his sword up once more. William didn't need to be told twice. He got up to his feet, this time holding his sword over his right shoulder rather than directly over his head. As his anger got the better of him, he couldn't hold back from yelling with exertion as he ran towards August. He slashed down at him with all his might once again. This time August sprung to the left, holding his own sword horizontally and parrying William's blow down to the ground. William wasn't done yet. He pulled his sword back up over his left shoulder and kept charging at August, taking another wild slash down with a loud yell of exertion. August expertly hopped aside from the slash towards William's right side, swiping down with his own sword and sending the tip of William's sword directly into the ground. He continued his motion into William, colliding roughly with him and sending him off balance and down into the grass. Swordsmanship is an art form. Relying on sheer strength alone will not help you. "You're coming at me like a buffalo," said August, taking a step back from William. Every word he said sent a wave of loathing through William's core, amplifying his hatred and deepening his resentment for the man. As Eric watched on, he suddenly realized how far out of hand things had become. As William sat on the ground, catching his breath and reaching back for his sword again, Eric suddenly caught sight of that look in his eyes. He hadn't seen it since that night on the back of the cart. But looking at him now, Eric realized that things were just about to spiral completely out of control. "William, stop! You need to keep control of yourself," cried out Eric desperately from the sidelines. He couldn't say too much in front of Sir August, but Eric needed William to realize that if he continued like this, he was going to lose himself to the monster within. Eric's words echoed in the back of William's mind. "Forget about him. He doesn't matter right now. Focus," whispered the voice in William's ear. Again, the voice was right. It didn't matter what Eric was saying. Right now, all that mattered was destroying the man stood before him. He reached for his sword again, the anger and loathing swelling in his stomach like a ball of energy. Once William had gotten back up to his feet, he looked up and stared August in the eyes. What August saw within those eyes shook him to his core. He hadn't seen this look in somebody's eyes for many years. He'd certainly never seen it in the eyes of one of his students. It was a look of animalistic fury. The boy wanted him dead. He didn't just want to land a hit on him, he wanted to destroy him, and August could feel it. "Hey now, you need to calm down, boy," said August seriously, tightening his grip on his sword. William snarled angrily, holding his sword out to his side and beginning to charge at August again. This time, the speed with which the boy came bolting towards him took August a little off guard. He was charging at him in a sloppy kind of tailguard stance, ready to swipe his sword upwards into August's side. August waited for the moment that William's blade began to rise. As soon as it did, he took a step backwards and swung his sword down to defend the swipe. The amount of resistance he felt when his sword collided with William's sent a shock through his body. Just how strong was this kid? He might be coming at him with the wild disregard of a buffalo, but he was somehow mustering the strength of one too. Without a moment's hesitation, William kept running directly towards August, yelling furiously with exertion as he turned his deflected sword back around and above his head. He was ready to cut down at August with a ferocity that he had never seen from any of his students before. August's innate reaction was to get ready to block the blow, but just as he was about to raise his guard, he caught sight of William's eyes. What he saw behind them were not the eyes of a man, but of a monster. For but a second, he could have sworn he saw someone else, something else. In this moment, it was like time froze. He felt a chill run down his spine as a strange feeling of fear began to grip his heart. The smell of tansies burst over his senses, overwhelming him with confusion and nostalgia. As the momentary trance threatened to pull his mind from the battle, his years of experience suddenly kicked back in, drawing him back to the present and dispelling the trance that almost overcame him. With but a moment to spare, he managed to focus back on William's incoming blow. His instincts had spoken, and they'd told him that he shouldn't try to block this blow. August let the point of his sword fall to the ground as William's attack from overhead came cutting down at lightning speed. He barely had time to hop nimbly to the side, the blade whistling straight down in front of his face and down into his own sword with alarming power. The force of the blow was enough that William's wooden practice sword cracked in the middle, the blade splitting into two, sending an explosion of splinters into the grass. William was also sent toppling forward into the grass yet again. August's eyes opened wide in shock. Even with a training sword, if that had connected with him, he'd surely have been gravely injured. "You need to calm down," reiterated August, taking a step backwards from William, whose animalistic rage only seemed to be growing. William reached out for the handle of the sword lying in the grass beside him. With the split blade in his hand, William turned and looked up hatefully at August. Once again, August felt that chilling feeling of dread grip his heart, the smell of the tansies once more exploding over his senses. The boy wasn't done. William snarled again, springing forwards at August with the broken sword hilt in his left hand. The point of the sword was now a sharpened stick due to being snapped off and splintered. It was like William was coming at him with a dagger. As William dove at him with the wooden dagger in hand, he took a step to the left to dodge. William flew towards him, attempting to drive his wooden dagger into August's neck. August quickly dropped his sword and grabbed William's wrist, using his momentum to guide him down to the ground. He expertly twisted around the boy and knelt on his back, pinning him down into the grass in a wrestling hold. William snarled and yelled as he struggled to break free from the hold as August's knee dug into his brand wound. "What has gotten into you, boy?" asked August in disbelief as he felt the raw, animalistic strength of William pushing back against him as he writhed in agony on the floor. He couldn't believe that the amount of power he was feeling beneath him was coming from a teenage boy, and a small one at that. "Hey, get off him!" cried Eric. He ran over and pulled at Sir August, managing to wrench him off from William's branding wound. "William, can you hear me? William, please, I need you to get a grip," shouted Eric, running around and kneeling in front of William. The second that August's knee had dug into William's brand, the agony sent a shock coursing through his entire body. His vision faded to white as the excruciating pain overwhelmed his nerves. William suddenly felt himself regaining control over his body. As Eric's words burst into his psyche, William felt his mind returning to the present. He looked around at the three squires who had stopped their training to spectate the dramatic scene which had unfolded beside them. He looked around at Eric, who still had a hand placed on William's shoulder, and finally up at Sir August, who wore an expression of unease on his face. Now, back in control of his body, William suddenly felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Wrath, shame and anguish. Wrath for how the knights had behaved, shame at how he'd just made a fool of himself, and anguish over those he'd lost. As the floodgates opened, William couldn't hold it back. Tears began streaming down his face. Sir August let out a sigh, untensing his muscles and seeming to relax slightly when he saw that William didn't appear to be a threat anymore. A silence overcame the entire scene as William tried to regain his composure while the three spectating students looked on awkwardly. Sir August finally let out a breath of his own, shaking his head in disbelief. "Would you care to explain what that was all about then?" asked August in disbelief. William sat up slightly, still catching his breath. After what he'd just pulled, there was no holding back anymore. He was going to have to confront Sir August head-on. "Why are you helping me?" he asked shakily, tilting his head up and looking at August distrustfully. Eric helped him to stand. "Why do you think?" asked August, placing his hands on his hips and shaking his head. "I know that you want me to lose the fight. I know that you've organized this whole thing because you don't think I can do it," said William earnestly. Realization crossed August's face, and he let out another sigh. "So that's the root of all this anger? Listen, kid, what kind of knight would I be if I sent you in there completely untrained? asked August seriously. William stared back at him, not sure of how to answer. Where would be the honor in that? I wouldn't be respecting my own code, and I certainly wouldn't be respecting your honor as a fighter either. As a knight, I could never do that, said Sir August earnestly. William was taken aback by how sincere August's answer was, but it reignited some of the anger which lingered in William's heart. He closed his eyes and shook his head incredulously. Honor? You care about honor? Where was your honor when Father Marcus was hurting Anne-Marie? Where was your honor when she died because you didn't protect her? Asked William spitefully, opening his eyes back up and staring at August condemningly. August's eyes opened wide in surprise. What are you talking about? Asked August, looking between William and Eric in confusion. You probably don't even remember her, do you? She was probably just some commoner girl to you, said William spitefully. Sir August held up a finger and pointed it at William. Hey now, don't jump to any conclusions. I do remember who you're talking about. She was that sweet girl that came with us to the hot springs. Of course I remember her, he said defensively. Well, while the three of you were off frolicking in the springs, Father Marcus was having his way with her, cried William furiously, his voice cracking with emotion. August's face dropped into an expression of shock. You were supposed to protect her from him. You knew there was something wrong with him, and you still left them alone together, shouted William, once more having to hold back tears. For a moment, August was unable to respond. I had no clue. He didn't even seem in any fit state to do such a thing. She never said anything. I thought she was just upset because of what the cleric did to himself, stammered August, the true extent of his failures in Mistfall only now revealing themselves to him. She was only 14 years old. She died giving birth to his child. Her blood is on your hands, all three of you, yelled William spitefully. Eric's consoling hand on William's shoulder tightened as he too was overwhelmed by this emotional exchange. Sir August's expression darkened, and he looked down at the ground in shame. I had no idea that any of this had happened. I don't even know where to begin. I am truly sorry to you both for your loss, and yes, I do accept full responsibility for what happened to her. You're right. It was my duty to keep her safe, and I failed. Her death is on my shoulders, admitted August, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. Sir August's words sent a chill down William's spine. As he watched the crestfallen knight accepting responsibility for the pain he'd caused, he didn't feel anything like relief. Watching August learning of Anne-Marie's death brought William nothing but more misery. There was no rewarding feeling of justice or victory like he'd expected, just more pain, always more pain. There was a long moment of silence as August's words lingered in the air, the Mistfall tragedy once again spreading its tendrils of sorrow. Eric suddenly let go of William's shoulder and took a step forward. Sir August, you asked William what kind of knight you'd be if you sent him into that arena untrained, began Eric. How do you explain your two friends then? They seem to be perfectly okay with him going in there and losing the fight. You might be able to tell why Will and I have our reservations about knights, given what we've seen from the three of you, finished Eric intensely. August nodded understandingly. I can't defend our negligence in Mistfall, but when it comes to the combat trial, let me try to explain. What you need to understand about Ivar is that he's too cunning for his own good. He gets his head wrapped up so deeply in his schemes that he loses sight of the little things. Azalea's the opposite. She's too short-sighted. Truthfully, it would be her who would suffer the most if anything happened to you in that arena. I can guarantee that. She just hasn't thought that far ahead yet, said August earnestly, letting out a deep breath. William stood silently as he gathered his emotions and listened intently to August's words. When you did inevitably lose the fight, We planned to push the case that you showed enough bravery and honor by stepping into that arena at all that you should be granted admission to the college, admitted August, cringing at his own words as he spoke. William and Eric both shook their heads, realizing how ill thought out this plan was. We were lying to ourselves. I knew that the Chancellor would never accept that. If I'd realized it, I'm sure the others have too. The truth is simply that we just didn't care whether some commoner boy was enrolled into the college or not, admitted Sir August bluntly. William and Eric exchanged a look of sad realization as they listened to his words. There was yet another long silence as August's admission lingered in the air. August's other 3 students were still simply standing by, uncomfortably listening in to their theatrical exchange. "So? What now?" asked Eric suddenly, breaking the awkward silence. August brought his gaze back up to face him. "Now," began August. He looked between William and Eric intensely. "Now our training really begins," he said, looking William in the eyes. "If you'll allow me, I think that offering you training for the trial is the least that I can do," offered Sir August earnestly. Eric looked at William expectantly. Who would William be to throw a spanner in the works now? If Eric had been willing to throw his life into shambles to make it this far, he deserved that William make a similar effort. He took a deep breath. For Eric's sake, he was going to follow his lead and try to make the right decision. "We all played our part in letting Anne-Marie down. It wasn't just your fault. Thank you, though, for taking responsibility for your part," said William abashedly. Sir August nodded his head appreciatively. William cast another glance at Eric, making up his mind. This was something he could do. Finally, he had something that he wouldn't need to rely on Eric for. Eric had done his part by getting him this far. If William wanted to get into the college and find the answers that he needed, it was now going to be up to him. "If you'll put aside how I've acted today, I would greatly appreciate your training," said William earnestly. Sir August's expression brightened upon hearing William's brave words. He nodded excitedly. "You're going to win that fight, boy. I'll make sure of it. I don't care what the Chancellor has to say about it. You're going to win that fight," said Sir August with an assured nod. After a moment, a look of concern suddenly appeared on his face. "Just don't tell the others, okay?" he asked sheepishly. Despite the failures of the 3 knights, it was going to be up to William and Eric to put it all behind them if they wanted to move forward with their plans in the college. After a searching glance was shared between the two, William and Eric nodded in agreement. They had to keep their heads on task from now on. All that mattered now was passing this combat trial. William had a strong work ethic, and his tutor was a world-class fighter. But would he really have enough time? There was no telling how long it would be until the combat trial was held, and as proficient at the basics of swordplay as William may become, would it really be enough when faced by not merely a man, but a monster? Chapter 27. The Exam. William and Eric walked beside Azalea with a dark cloud hovering over their heads. It had been 2 weeks since William had begun training with Sir August. "Come on, boys, pluck up. I'm sure you'll be fine," said Azalea, looking down over the 2 crestfallen boys. They had been so focused on preparing William for his combat trial that they'd forgotten about something which had been staring them in the face since the first day they'd entered Oxgate. Be it the excitement of the training or the horrors that they were running away from, neither boy had thought about the fact that they too would have to sit the academic exam. All who were entering the college as squires were required to go through the process, even William. "Aren't we supposed to spend months preparing for these exams?" asked Eric, his face falling a shade paler as he imagined how complicated these exams were likely to be. "Oh, come now, after seeing you school the librarians on their own constitution, I have no doubts that you'll do fine," said Azalea assuredly. "What about me, though? I can barely even read." exclaimed William in desperation. Azalea shot an uneasy glance at Ivar, who sighed and rolled his eyes. "Look, boy, I'm not going to fluff it up for you. You're going to fail," said Ivar flatly. Immediately, William felt a swell of dread lurch through his stomach. "Ivar!" exclaimed Azalea angrily at his bluntness. "But," he began, raising his eyebrows at Azalea, "the academic exam means nothing for you anyway. It means nothing how you perform on that thing. You're entering the school on a loophole with this combat trial business," said Ivar aloofly as they walked onwards towards the exam hall. William actually felt surprisingly reassured by Ivar's words. His relief was unfortunately short-lived, however, as when they drew closer to the exam hall, William felt his anxiety rise again. There were a sea of pages his age, all gathering outside of the hall. "And here we are," said Azalea, drawing to a halt and putting a hand on each of the boys' shoulders. William looked over at Eric expectantly for reassurance, but immediately noticed that he seemed to be even more anxious than William. "Hey, are you okay?" asked William, nudging Eric. He turned to face William and slowly shook his head. "This is where we leave you, boys," said Azalea, patting them on their heads and ruffling their hair. William and Eric stared back at her in stunned silence. As Azalea looked over them one last time, a look of concern came across her face momentarily. "Look, Ivar is right. Don't worry too much about the exam. Focus your energy on that combat trial. And as for Rothmane, I'm sure you'll do fine. Listen, you're well ahead of these other pages in knowledge, trust me. What you boys have been doing for work is very similar to what they've been doing in their page duties too. Dare I say it goes beyond in most cases. You're not beneath these nobles, no matter how it seems, okay?" asked Azalea, her expression of concern seeming to fade to one of soft admiration for the two strong boys before her. They both nodded appreciatively at her kind words. "Good luck," she said, balling her fist up supportively before hurrying off to catch up with Ivar, who had already begun walking away. The two boys stood in a shook silence for a moment, watching the crowd from afar, before William realized that for once he was going to have to take the reins where morale was concerned. "Hey!" said William, patting Eric on the shoulder roughly. Eric slowly turned to face him, his face still wearing a forlorn expression of dread. "Come on, brother. You heard them. There's nothing to worry about. Let's do this," said William, mustering his best attempt at fake enthusiasm. Eric was unmoved by his bogus fervour, simply staring back at him silently. William let out a sigh. "Don't you realize it, Eric? We're about to sit the exams to become squires. Look how far we've come," exclaimed William, gesturing around them. Eric nodded in agreement, following William's lead and looking around them in awe. "Let's get in there and show these noble bastards what us Lactorians are capable of," said William enthusiastically, raising his fist expectantly. Eric's expression seemed to soften, and a small smirk appeared on his mouth as he exhaled shakily. He raised his fist up, reciprocating William's fist bump. With that, the two of them set forth to join the crowd of pages. Everybody was gathering in a small courtyard outside a beautiful old stone hall. William was getting used to the fact that all of the architecture here was superb. He hadn't seen a single building or even a stretch of road that was not perfect and clean. Obviously, everything paled in comparison to the great library, but even something as quaint as this little hall was beautifully upkept, despite clearly being quite old. Upon joining the mass of students gathering in the courtyard, William was immediately struck by how little attention he and Eric were garnering. He'd expected it to be a tight-knit community with existing friendship circles of judgmental, toffee-nosed, spoiled brats who would be resistant to outsiders, but as he and Eric made their way into the mass and found a section of the courtyard's low stone wall to sit on, nobody paid them a second glance. Be it the gowns that they were wearing, or simply the fact that they were in the noble district at all, they somehow seemed to be blending in. William knew that the difference between nobles and commoners was far more complicated than what they were wearing or where they were standing, but at this moment it really did all feel quite imaginary. "Hey," said Eric, tapping William anxiously, "I'm going to deliberately fail the exam," he said, releasing a shaky, anxious breath. "What? Eric, no! Why in the world would you do that?" asked William in surprise. "This exam is all about figuring out which order to put us in. We have to get the same scores in the same areas if we want to be eligible for the same orders," explained Eric. A chill suddenly ran down William's spine. He hadn't even thought about the orders yet. If he and Eric were in different orders, what would that even mean? William didn't know the first thing about the Knights' College. He hadn't even thought about what all these orders meant. "Is that important?" asked William, swallowing nervously. Eric took a breath and nodded his head. "If we're in different orders, we'll have different classes, live in different order halls, and tread entirely different pathways into knighthood," said Eric, thinking aloud as he looked around at all of the pages chattering excitedly amongst themselves. William once again felt his stomach sink. If he and Eric were in different orders, that would leave William on his own amongst all these nobles. The idea of being cut off from Eric and his wisdom filled William's heart with panic. Eric placed a consoling hand on William's shoulder. "Hey, relax. As I said, I'll fail my exam," said Eric. William took a moment to gather his nerves and tried to think about the situation more clearly. They were here to learn as much as they could about the Gateway Anne-Marie and the brand on William's back. That was the most important thing. In the worst-case scenario, one where they were separated, they could still work together towards that common goal. Surely. How different could the orders be? They were all in the same city. It's not like they'd be countries apart. He took a deep breath and looked at Eric quizzically. "Eric, do you remember what those signs in the library said about only allowing students from the Order of the Owl in?" asked William. Eric seemed to be caught off guard, averting his gaze and not answering the question. William's heart began to sink. "Eric, what about what Sir Roland said? He said you'd be perfect for the Order of the Owl," insisted William, pushing Eric's shoulder roughly to get him to make eye contact. "If you fail your exam, will you be able to get into the Order of the Owl or not?" asked William, suddenly realizing the conundrum that Eric was facing. Eric slowly shook his head, letting out another anxious breath. William let out a frustrated sigh of his own. He couldn't hold Eric back. The most important thing was getting the information they needed. It didn't matter how scared William was, he couldn't put his own fear ahead of their mission. "Eric, you don't have to babysit me. I'll get by fine on my own, even if we're in separate orders." "Don't you trust me?" asked William, looking at Eric quizzically. Eric stared back at him, his reticence obvious in his expression. "Eric, promise me that you won't fail your exam," said William seriously. Eric seemed to be considering his words deeply. "William, began Eric, before suddenly a man shook a small handbell, drawing the crowd into a silence as they all turned to look at him. He was a short, bald man who was adorned with some extremely fancy turquoise ceremonial regalia and a pompous cap. The lavish robes included a plethora of badges worn proudly across his chest. "Welcome everybody to your Squire exams," began the man excitedly from atop the hall's tiny front steps, looking over all of the students. "I am Chancellor Graham Headley, and I am in charge of this college. For many of you, this is my first time meeting you, but hopefully not my last. Allow me, please, to first congratulate you all on making it through your duties as pages," said the Chancellor, stopping his speech to allow for applause. William and Eric joined in awkwardly, feeling dishonest at sharing this undue praise. "I know that it has been a very difficult few years, but if you're still here, then that means you've made it through. I'm proud of each and every one of you," announced the Chancellor, looking over all of them with a beaming smile on his face. William and Eric exchanged an uncomfortable glance. This exam is simply used to gather some information about you all to help us better decide which order you'll be placed into. Please, relax. If you're here, you've already made it into the college, so wipe those forlorn expressions off your faces." The Chancellor continued warmly, earning a relieved chuckle from some of the students. William shuffled anxiously on the spot. He was the only student among them to whom this truly didn't apply. He would only actually be enrolled in this college if he completed his trial by combat. "After completing today's exam, you will be presented with offers from orders to which you are eligible in the coming weeks. I wish you good luck. I look forward to meeting you all individually and to seeing your bright futures begin within the walls of our college," finished the Chancellor warmly, earning an appreciative applause from the crowd. With that, the crowd began to slowly mill towards the entrance of the hall. The Chancellor seemed to be looking searchingly through the crowd, but William's mind was a million miles away by this point. The panic of entering into an exam of any kind was suddenly filling every inch of his body. He'd never sat any kind of exam in his life. Anxiety was running rampant all over his body. As the boys entered the hall, they were immediately separated in the sea of students. William searched for Eric in the crowd, but was distracted as he was herded into the exam room. He was filled with a sense of awe as he entered the hall and saw the banners of all the knights' orders hanging on the walls. He hadn't imagined that there would be so many different orders to choose from. Each banner was different, and they were hanging on every wall of the hall. A crest was displayed on each banner, including a lion, a horse, a wasp, a serpent, a fox, and all sorts of other intricate iconography. He didn't have much time to think about it, however, as he spotted an empty table which he staked his claim to quickly before anybody else could. As soon as he sat down, he began looking around for Eric, who he eventually managed to locate sitting at a table on the far end of the hall. He was looking up at a blue banner with an owl on it, deep in thought. William let out a sigh as he watched his friend considering his conundrum. William hoped that Eric would make the right decision, but he had a sinking feeling in his gut that he was going to tank the exam. William had given him no indication that he was able to take care of himself. He had been leaning on Eric far too much. Because of his own lack of autonomy, Eric was going to have to pick up his slack as usual. William rested his head in his hands as he ruminated on his shortcomings. After all the pages had taken a seat, a small handbell was rung from the front of the room, garnering everyone's attention. The staff member at the front of the room put the handbell down on the desk and cleared her throat before beginning to explain the rules of the exam. Each word that came out of her mouth made William feel more and more hopeless. He hadn't even learned how to read and write properly yet, and now he was sitting in an exam hall in the Knights' College, listening to a confusing set of instructions which he was already struggling to remember. Somebody suddenly approached him from behind and dropped an exam booklet onto his table before continuing down the row of students. William stared at the closed exam booklet in front of him. Before he even had a chance to read what was written on the cover, the bell was once again rung. As soon as it hit its first chime, the hall erupted with the sound of 100 booklets being opened. William tentatively reached out towards his booklet and opened the first page. It was a contents page which listed each of the sections of the exam. His jaw dropped at what he saw as butterflies immediately began fluttering furiously in his stomach. Algorithm? Rhetoric? William was already lost, and so far he'd only seen the section titles listed on the contents page. The panic that had been building in Eric's mind was showing no signs of desisting. The more that he looked around at the banners plastering the walls, the more that he felt the weight of his ancestors on his shoulders. Could he really fail the exam? Where was the honor in that? Where was the chivalry? He had no doubt that William could take care of himself. That wasn't what was concerning Eric. He had seen firsthand the insidious force which lurked within his friend. He'd seen it not only when it had first come to his farmstead, or when William had been at the gypsy camp, but during the moments in between. He'd seen it in William's eyes when he'd pulled him up onto the cart as they were escaping the moor crawlers. He'd felt its presence during William's fight with Sir August. He'd felt it in his nightmares as he'd slept mere meters from him. William was radiating a deep and powerful darkness which was only becoming stronger by the day. Eric needed to be there when things went wrong. He needed to be there not just to keep William safe, but to keep those around him safe. Whoever was unlucky enough to find themselves sharing a dormitory with William would be facing nightmares unlike any that they'd ever faced in their life. Eric had still not told this to William. He already had enough on his shoulders, bearing such a burden in the first place. The night terrors that Eric had been suffering had only gone unnoticed due to William's own nightmares keeping him preoccupied. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his frustrated mind. Until they knew more about the darkness inside William, what was there that Eric could do for him? Even if they were sharing a dorm, if things really escalated any further, there was little more Eric could do to help. He'd exhausted his shallow knowledge of the gateway when he'd used his great-grandfather's sigil. Without learning more, when that worst-case event did happen, Eric was going to be useless. It didn't matter whether he was sharing a dorm with William or not. He needed to learn more. He needed to find answers, and he wouldn't be able to do that if he was stuck in some lowly order with William and the other low scorers. He turned and looked over at his friend. He had an open-mouthed expression of pure fear on his face as he was reading his exam booklet. Eric let out another sigh. He turned back down to his own exam booklet and opened to the contents page. He was immediately shocked by what he saw. Algorithm? Rhetoric? A lot of these sections were going to be far easier for him than he'd expected. These older fields of study remained unchanged for centuries. His great-grandfather's textbooks that he'd grown up reading would be enough to carry him through most of these more general sections. He immediately got to work. He might as well read through the exam questions at least. He couldn't resist. The idea of challenging himself academically like this was exciting. Even if he aced the first sections, he could always fail the last sections and still arrive at a low overall score. He hurriedly buried himself in the exam paper, feeling his anxiety beginning to ease. The comfort and joy he was getting out of testing his knowledge was just the distraction he'd needed from his woes. William turned yet another page without understanding a single question. He kept reminding himself of what Sir Ivar had said about this not mattering for him, but he still couldn't quite put his anxious mind at ease. As he looked around at all the other students his age voraciously writing out their answers, he was filled with shame. How, in the same years of life as he'd lived, had all of these people learned so much? He knew he was far behind, but he hadn't quite realized the extent of it. As he rifled through page after page, there was not a single question that he could answer in the entire exam. History, geography, heraldry, aristocracy, instruments of war, chivalry, William knew nothing about any of it. Just as his shame and despair was reaching its peak, he finally turned to a section of the exam which caught him by surprise. It had a diagram of a horse's anatomy, with each muscle and bone labelled with numbers. William felt excitement swell in his chest. Finally, some questions that he could answer. He looked at the title and noticed that the section was labelled Animal Husbandry. As far as William could see, most of the questions were related to horses. Some questions were about breeds, some were about horse care, and some were just about anatomy. William got stuck into answering every question that he could. By the time that he was done with answering all the horse-related questions, he realized that he'd taken up the majority of the exam's time limit. Even just reading the questions had taken him a while. He'd taken up a large amount of the space on his parchment, with his excessively large handwriting in his answers too. He hadn't so much as touched a quill since he was taken out of school as a young boy. He looked around the room at all the stressed-out students hurriedly trying to answer as many questions as they could before the time ran out. How were they answering all these sections on the same amount of parchment he'd used? William's heart was filled with relief when he saw Eric excitedly scrawling away at his exam sheet too. It looked like he'd decided not to fail the exam after all. William let himself relax and breathed a sigh of relief, sinking slightly deeper into his chair. As his eyes wandered, he looked to the front of the room. The staff member there was looking back at him quizzically. William immediately straightened up in his chair and cleared his throat awkwardly. Everybody else was still scrawling away at their exams. He suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. "If you're finished, please leave the hall," whispered a staff member from over his shoulder. William nodded obediently, standing from his chair and scraping it loudly in the process, drawing the ire of many nearby students. He hurried out of the hall as quickly as he could, blushing at his lack of etiquette. Eric stared blankly at the question in front of him, with panic beginning to rise in his chest. He'd worked his way through the entire exam booklet and simply skipped over a few questions that he hadn't immediately been able to recall answers to. He'd quite early on discovered a real hurdle for himself. The questions pertaining to current aristocracy were really stumping him. The fact that all the books that he'd read were extremely old was really showing. How could he not know the name of the current Viscount of the Bleaklands? He'd literally travelled through their county on his way to Oxgate. It was barely a stone's throw from the moorlands as it was. He could forgive himself for missing a few questions about Castellian nobility or the Northern Kingdom's social structure, but the thought of missing something so close to home hurt. Suddenly he was pulled from his thoughts as a chair scraped loudly from behind him. Eric turned his head and saw William hurriedly leaving the room with a blushing red face. Eric smiled upon seeing how out of place William clearly was in such scholarly surroundings. Suddenly, the answer to his question came bursting into the forefront of his mind. "William, Count William Terwin." Eric hurriedly wrote down his answer, when suddenly the sound of the handbell erupted over the room. "Quills down, now!" instructed the staff member at the front of the room, standing from their chair and looking over the students seriously. "That includes you, Mr. Strathmore," she continued, raising her eyebrows seriously at a boy who was sitting beside Eric that hadn't stopped writing yet. Eric looked at him in surprise. Strathmore? If the boy sitting next to him really was of the Strathmore family, then he was practically seated beside royalty. There were literally questions in the exam about the boy's family. The Strathmore family were about as high up the chain of nobility as one could get. The mere fact that Eric had heard of them in his great-grandfather's books showed how old and powerful their family was. The Strathmore boy sighed in frustration and dropped his pen before raising his own eyebrows back at the staff member challengingly. She cleared her throat uncomfortably before looking back over the hall. "You may now leave the exam hall. Please leave in an orderly fashion," she announced, as all of the students stood up and began to stampede towards the front door. As soon as William caught sight of Eric, he called out and beckoned to him. As Eric approached him, William could tell that he'd brightened up considerably since before the exam. "How'd you go?" asked Eric, looking expectantly at William. "How do you think?" asked William glumly. Eric chuckled in response. "Those questions were impossible," grumbled William. As Eric seemed to be considering how to respond, he was interrupted by somebody tapping him on the shoulder. It was the boy that William had seen sitting next to Eric. He had pale skin, jet-black hair, and intense brown eyes. "Hey, thanks for the answers, big guy. How'd you know all that stuff about ancient heraldry? Did they have you stationed in the archives?" asked the boy. William raised his eyebrows in surprise. Eric had given this guy answers. If he could have given anybody answers, it should have been William. "What?" asked Eric, seemingly confused. The boy laughed at him. "Look, I don't know if you were trying to or not, but you made it real easy to copy you," said the boy, shaking his head. "Either way, just wanted to say I'm impressed. What family are you from?" "I've never seen you before," asked the boy curiously. "Oh, I'm Eric Rothmain," replied Eric, scratching the back of his head awkwardly and extending his other hand to shake the boy's hand. "Rothmain? I thought the Rothmans were dead," said the boy in surprise, reciprocating Eric's handshake. William chuckled to himself. Everybody seemed to say the same thing when they met him. "What are you laughing at?" asked the boy suddenly, glaring at William. "Oh, nothing. It's just, everybody says that is all," answered William defensively. The boy looked William up and down suspiciously. "And you are?" he asked. William stammered for a moment, his awkward childhood memories of being a social outcast suddenly flashing back before his eyes. "This is William, my best friend," said Eric flatly, taking a step closer to William. The boy looked between the two of them curiously. "William who?" asked the boy. William was not getting good vibes from this guy. He really didn't want to reveal his commoner ancestry to him. He stammered again when it came to answering the question. "Lacdorian. And you're a Strathmore, yeah?" answered Eric, his tone slightly more serious than before. The boy tilted his head and furrowed his brow, seemingly deep in thought. "I swear I've heard of the Lacdorians before, but I can't remember where from. I never was good at memorizing the lower houses." "Oh well," said the boy with a shrug. William and Eric both decided to stay quiet. It seemed like the thought of a page being a commoner was so unheard of that it might not even occur as a possibility to most people. "Yeah, I'm a Strathmore. Eamon Strathmore," replied the boy with a bored tone, looking around distractedly. There was a sharp whistle from behind them which caught William's attention. When he turned, he beheld the fanciest black and gold carriage he'd ever seen in his life. "My family's here. Thanks again for the answers, Rothmain. Hope you choose the Drake," said the boy, walking over towards the carriage. A butler in fancy dress who had blown the whistle opened the door of the carriage and let down a mechanical staircase for Eamon to walk up. Inside the carriage, William could see a lord and lady wearing extremely fancy black clothes, looking at him and Eric suspiciously. "Come on, William, let's get some lunch," said Eric, turning away from the carriage and beginning to walk back towards town. "Who are those people?" asked William, looking over his shoulder curiously as the carriage began to leave. "They're the Strathmores. Best not to get on their bad side, yeah?" suggested Eric, drifting off into thought. William nodded affirmatively. "What did he mean about the Drake?" asked William, looking over his shoulder again as he watched the carriage rolling away. "Did you see the red and gold banner with the dragony thing on it in the exam hall?" asked Eric. William tried his best, but couldn't recall any one banner in particular. There were so many that he'd become overwhelmed. He shook his head. "Well, that's the Order of the Drake. Ain't no high-up noble in power what came from any other order," said Eric, seeming to drift off into deep thought. William looked at his friend and narrowed his eyes. If Eamon had told him to choose the Drake, then that confirmed that the Rothmain name wasn't just any noble house, it was one of the high houses. Had Eric just never told William about how important his noble heritage was, or had he not yet even realized it himself? He was always so intelligent and keen-minded until it came to his own accolades. If Eric ever did realize how powerful his name was, how long would he stay by William's side? How long would he be willing to hang around with a commoner from a pile of mud in the moors with a monster living inside of him?